Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharif Deen. I'm a Wurruttian Gurrabunna Gungandji bummer from far north Queensland originally, but I live and work on Gumbaynggirr country on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. My role, and the reason I'm here today, is that I'm the head of Secretariat for the New South Wales Coalition of Aboriginal Community Control Peak Organisations. My purpose here today is to provide an update on work that's being done or has been done on an independent government accountability mechanism, which is a commitment under the National Agreement. So there's a commitment under the National Agreement on Closing the Gap to do work and implement an independent accountability mechanism. So if you bear with me, so I don't miss key points, I will reference my notes and those sorts of things, and I'll try to speak loudly because as much as I'm a big person, my voice is not necessarily that loud and doesn't carry. Before I proceed, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and the elders past and present, not only of this country, but of the countries from which everyone who is here today is from. As I was saying, being a North Queensland blackfellow, I'm always a visitor on country here in New South Wales, so we were taught by our old people to introduce ourselves and acknowledge Aboriginal people in the room as well. In terms of the structure about how I'll go through the presentation today, I'll do a bit of a background on the commitment under the National Agreement, outline the design process and engagements that we went through, talk a bit about the recommended model and provide a bit of context around recommended model versus the opportunity for other models. What the project team from CAPO heard from community during the engagement and consultation processes and how this is reflected in the model, and also touching on the researching and mapping that informed the model and a bit about next steps as well. And there'll also be an opportunity for people to ask questions if they like. So who is New South Wales CAPO? So as I was saying, it's a coalition of Aboriginal community control peak organisations. There are 10 members in New South Wales. We've got ABSEC, the Aboriginal Legal Service, the AECG, or the Aboriginal Education Consultative Group, New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council, Link Up New South Wales, First Peoples Disability Network, Black. Black is our peak for our LGBTQI plus community, the Aboriginal Culture, Heritage and Arts Association, and the newest member is the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association. In terms of CAPO, as I was saying, Aboriginal community control, which means governed by and answerable to our members, and our members have to be Aboriginal people or Aboriginal organisations. So independent government accountability mechanism. So recently, New South Wales CAPO launched our report at New South Wales Parliament. The report outlines the proposed model for an independent Aboriginal-led government accountability mechanism, the commitment to establish an independent, the commitment to establish a government accountability mechanism is significant, and it has the opportunity to bring about real change on the ground for our communities. It responds to decades-long calls from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for increased government accountability, and Aboriginal community in New South Wales has expressed a strong interest in greater government accountability, not only through the consultation process, but throughout every Closing the Gap engagement we've done, plus previous engagements. The report itself is a product of a detailed design process that has included strong community engagement, desktop research and expert advice. So in terms of delivering the recommended model, as I was saying, the model is based on rigorous design processes. When we talk about evidence and research, there was desktop research done, but in terms of expert advice, we engaged with experts on government accountability that are experts in their field academically and otherwise. I'll just move to talking about the implementation plan, the New South Wales Closing the Gap implementation plan. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, In the National Agreement for Closing the Gap, one of the commitments is the establishment of an independent accountability mechanism to hold government and mainstream organisations accountable for implementation of Closing the Gap. Through consultation processes in New South Wales, when we talked about that commitment in the National Agreement, Aboriginal communities, so all over the state, talked about the fact that it needs to go further than just being an accountability mechanism for government and mainstream services, but actually in the starting point, actually start with government first. The strong reason for that and the strong sentiment behind that is that when children are removed, for example, our communities carry the accountability for that. When government agencies make bad decisions, when they act in bad faith, if a decision has been proved to be incorrect, wrong, however we want to look at it, our community still carries the accountability, but nothing really happens to the agency or to the individual staff that make those decisions. We'll all probably know examples of where bad decision's been made and the person who made the decision acted in bad faith pops up in another area working in the agency. So that's why in the model that that's being proposed and in the New South Wales implementation plan, it specifically calls for an independent government accountability mechanism and one that's Aboriginal-led. So for our communities, we know that there is the Ombudsman's Office, there's the Children's Guardian, there's the Audit Office, there's a range of existing accountability mechanisms. Where they fall short for our communities is that they're not led by us and we don't feel that we have ownership of them. So there's a very specific call for it being an Aboriginal-led accountability mechanism. I'm not sure if the text or the font is big enough for people, but we wanted to represent what we'd heard from people, from our communities, and what we will do is what the commitment is in the implementation plan. So bear with me for putting you through the torture of listening to me for any longer than you absolutely need to, but what our commitment was is to design an independent Aboriginal-led accountability mechanism to monitor government accountability. That commitment was that by 2024 we will develop a pilot design for an Aboriginal-led accountability mechanism to monitor the alignment of government policies on closing the gap. This will be based on foundational work and research on the best model and design for this accountability mechanism. The accountability mechanism will include at least two core aspects. First being establishment of the core criteria to monitor, improve and evaluate alignment of government policies and programs with the Closing the Gap commitments to transform government organisations and services. And the second is to establish an independent Aboriginal accountability authority. Following the design phase, there will be a trial period and then implementation of the mechanism. So in terms of our approach to the design process, our approach has been an Aboriginal-led process, informed by, as much as I understand the irony here, but in terms of it being an Aboriginal-led design process, the process we use is informed by what's called the Double Diamond framework, which is pioneered in the UK. The key elements of this design were stakeholder engagements with community engagement as a centrepiece and research into what makes an effective accountability mechanism. We undertook the design process in two phases. Phase one is effectively answering the big questions, so seeking to understand the scope of the problem through a desktop gap analysis and community's expectations of a mechanism. Phase two is based on findings from the first phase, drafting potential options for the mechanism. We then took these out for feedback from community, government and experts and conducted research into what makes an effective accountability mechanism. The CAPO leadership then considered the findings from across the project and have recommended a model for the mechanism based on these. So this is a bit more background on the consultation. It outlines the engagements we undertook across the two phases. In total, we held 33 face-to-face workshops with community. We also undertook a deliberative forum. So a deliberative forum is an innovative approach that brings together, or in this case brought together 20 community members from across New South Wales for 3 online workshops and a face-to-face full-day workshop to provide a considered recommendation regarding the mechanism. In total, we reached In total, we reached 637 people through our community engagements, providing us with a robust sample size to inform our design. And the reason we talk about it being a robust sample size is that once you get to a certain saturation of consultation, you don't generally find, sorry to bore you with stats, but you generally don't find much of a change. So in terms of saying robust sample size, it's based on whether or not there's going to be any variance in what you hear after that point. We have produced 2 community engagement reports about the 2 phases, which are available on our website. In terms of the phase 1 workshops, these are the locations, so that's more just a graphical representation of places we got to across the state. In the phase 1, as I was saying, we went out and asked broadly what community wanted from the mechanism. Like we understood and knew that there was a desire and a need for an independent accountability mechanism, but you need to actually start asking the question of what community wants to see, especially if it's for us. Phase 2, again, I think we may have gotten to a couple of extra places in phase 2. Phase 2 was about taking out options of the functions, features, tools and structures for community refinement, and talking about ranking, prioritisation, adding in details or ones that we were missing, potentially. So talking about the types of accountability mechanism, what do we mean when we say mechanism? There are 3 key kinds of accountability mechanisms in parliamentary democracies. Those 3 key kinds are political accountability mechanisms. As the slide says, it's the use of regular elections and fixed terms for office, providing regular intervals for decision makers to be held accountable by the citizens for their performance. That's ultimately what an election is about. There's legal accountability mechanisms, which refers to judicial processes that enforce the rule of law. Courts are the key players in this mechanism, at this type of mechanism. The third is the administrative accountability mechanisms, which are regulatory enforcers of government obligation. These are most often independent statutory bodies, so that's where you're talking about your auditor's office, ombudsman's office, those sorts of statutory authorities. We also then looked at a 4th mechanism, which is social accountability, because it speaks to what came up in community consultations and provides an avenue for community to be involved. So one of the really core, strong things that we heard from community is that not only do we want an independent Aboriginal-led accountability mechanism, but there needs to be a way in which our communities can engage in that process. When we think about it, it's like we often will see things that we want to report, things that we need to raise, and there are processes whereby you can lodge a complaint with the Ombudsman's office, or you can bring something to the attention of the audit office. What community wants is a mechanism by which community has a direct interplay and interaction. That's not community saying that they want to make the decisions and make the findings and hand down the findings and those sorts of things, but there needs to be a proper way for community to engage and have and feel ownership of that mechanism. So social accountability has been developed in international development. It involves ordinary people in the oversight of governments. It's aimed at strengthening the voice of citizens and increasing, I'm swinging my hands around a lot and I end up bumping the microphone. It's aimed at strengthening the voice of citizens, increasing demands for transparency and accountability, and improving the quality of governance. You can see an example at the bottom of what a cycle of social accountability looks like in practice. So at the bottom, it talks about citizens are informed of their rights and entitlements. Citizens voice their opinions about government performance. Citizens' opinions are transmitted to government. Government faces consequences for not being responsive, and then the feedback is provided back to citizens. And that feedback back to community is one of the critical loops that's missing now. We've probably all got examples where we've raised something with the Ombudsman's office and you never hear anything again, and if you do, it's a report that's published down the track. That's not a criticism here or there, it's just what our experiences are and how people have been informed through their experiences. So in terms of the recommended model, the recommended model that New South Wales CAPO had recommended is that a new administrative accountability body is established, referred to as the authority, which will work in formal partnership with a social accountability wing to embed community engagement and ownership of this approach. The purpose of this mechanism will be to hold New South Wales Government to account to Aboriginal people for achieving transformative change to improve Aboriginal outcomes. Government means public servants, senior executives, parliamentarians, ministers, public sector workers that are employed through different processes such as police, health workers and teachers are included in the public service. The mechanism will initially use implementation of Closing the Gap as a lens to define its priorities, though to ensure that the mechanism lasts beyond the national agreement and remains flexible to connecting with emerging priorities, particularly whatever priorities our communities are setting. The idea is that it will not be limited to monitoring the national agreement and not be limited to monitoring the New South Wales implementation plan. Again, that is built on and from feedback from community saying that we might start at that, but community's been very clear around the fact that we want an accountability mechanism that runs in perpetuity and actually represents or it takes action on things that we want to see. In terms of the administrative accountability wing, the idea of the administrative accountability wing in the recommended model is that it would be a new authority, referred to as the authority, made up of an office of technical experts, the office that is overseen by a board of directors, or we'd refer to as the board. The authority will be an independent entity, which is not affiliated with government. Board directors will require a mix of technical skills, Aboriginal knowledge, lived experience, community connections and intersectional identities, including where people are from, gender identities, age, abilities, disabilities, etc. Again, reflective of what we've heard from communities is that we often, in some of those other accountability mechanisms that are referenced, people made reference to the fact that those of us, all of us that are Aboriginal people have different lived experiences, and there are some of our community that have a long lived experience of growing up in and connected to community. And then there's some of us that are newer to our Aboriginality that haven't had the benefit of growing up with our mob. What community wants to see is that when there's organisations or entities like the accountability mechanism, they want to see themselves represented. So mob want to see mob. Mob want to see people who grew up in regional remote communities, people who grew up in old missions, people who grew up in out-of-home care, people who have survived stolen gens and those sorts of things. One of the things we've been very deliberate on is making sure we represent very strongly those sorts of things. The appointments to the board, importantly, will be undertaken by an independent committee. So another really strong piece of feedback from communities, they don't want hand-picked representatives. They want whatever committee or whatever mechanism is used to select board members, that it be independent of government, and that it not entrench previous behaviours of someone being approached to jump into a role because they have a profile sort of thing. In terms of the social accountability wing, so the social accountability wing will be established through a formal relationship between the authority and, in the early stages, New South Wales CAPO. The reason for New South Wales CAPO being mentioned is that as the formal Aboriginal partner and signatories to the Closing the Gap National Agreement, CAPO's role will be to facilitate community input into accountability processes. And when we say facilitate, what that means is that it will initially be achieved at community level through a CAPO engagement process. In the medium to long term, the intention is that this role will transition to place-based partnerships, and CAPO then being able to step away from that process. The idea of transitioning to place-based partnerships as they are established is that those place-based partnerships will be led by and driven by the agenda of local communities. So rather than having someone external, as much as we're blackfellas, rather than having us living elsewhere and coming in and facilitating processes and assisting with that, ultimately, community, if we're talking about social accountability, community gets to actually play an active role in that. CAPO's role would be limited to ensuring that Aboriginal community members are properly engaged through a social accountability process by the authority, and CAPO would not be involved in making assessments or decisions regarding the outcomes of accountability processes. So it is purely a facilitation process to ensure that the mechanism for community to be able to engage with the authority is facilitated. In terms of, I'll just talk a bit about place-based partnerships. Place-based partnerships are also an initiative under the National Agreement and the New South Wales Implementation Plan, where local partnership groups come together to address the priorities of the community and work with government to more effectively deliver services, programs and policies. And the idea being that the agenda is set by communities, that communities and those place-based partnerships are funded and resourced appropriately by government, and actually given the resources, that resource sit with community, and community has control over that. In terms of functions, one of the things is that the mechanism will have two functions. One will be to work with existing accountability processes and community to get the best outcomes for Aboriginal people. One of the things that came through the consultations was around needing to not only have the ability for an Aboriginal-led independent accountability mechanism to receive referrals, but also make referrals, and also be future-proof, I'll say future-proof, but also be forward-looking. We have a call, like there's a call for a commissioner for Aboriginal young people. Other states are starting to progress that. We're not quite there in New South Wales, but we're mindful of the fact that if we have those mechanisms that are set up to do specific functions, there's a need to make sure that however this independent accountability mechanism is set up, has the functionality to be able to make referrals where they're appropriate and receive referrals. So there might be things that are initially reported to an independent mechanism that a Children's Commissioner is set up specifically to run the accountability process for. The key thing is being able to make those references, and there might be things that come the other way. I can spitball ideas, but we do know there are situations where you might complain to the Ombudsman's office and the Ombudsman said, oh, this needs to go to the Children's Guardian. Or you make a complaint to the Children's Guardian and the Children's Guardian rightly says, well, this is not something that falls within our remit, so it needs to be referred somewhere else. Community, we're pretty clear around making sure that we're not pigeonholed and that it's not cut off from things. In terms of working with existing accountability bodies to ensure they effectively address concerns regarding Aboriginal outcomes, this will include supporting processes to invest sufficient resources and to provide cultural safety and relevant expertise. To promote community inclusion and transparency processes and strengthening communities' capacity to hold government to account. Support community to raise their concerns through existing relevant channels, facilitate community input into existing review processes, potentially through community scorecards or other social accountability processes. Ensure community receives meaningful feedback regarding transparency processes, and invest in community knowledge of accountability processes and relevant skills to engage in them. The second function is lead Aboriginal-owned accountability processes. So that will be to conduct its own reviews, inquiries and audits on issues where Aboriginal-led independence is needed, focus on areas where government lacks independent oversight currently, e.g. police investigating police, make recommendations and ensure corresponding action is taken following accountability processes, e.g. use a sliding scale of positive incentives and negative consequences or negative levers to drive change. So that point is around the fact that our community were really strong on saying there needs to be teeth. We can't have something that's there as an independent accountability mechanism that doesn't have the ability to wield any power. At the same time, there's also feedback around trying to incentivise or trying to encourage people to change without, some of the feedback in from experts in the field is that if all you have is a big stick you can have grotesque consequences where people are then sometimes maliciously compliant, where they will do things and swamp you with information to distract you from what you're actually looking at, but also creating grotesque consequences where we already know where people get preoccupied with chasing numbers and targets rather than doing the transformational work which actually leads to the reduction in those numbers. It'll be one of the other functions would be to hold regular budget, Senate estimate style hearings, communicate regularly with secretaries, ministers and other government leaders, and publish information about government funding for Aboriginal outcomes broken down by community and other relevant criteria. So some of these are already things that community wants to see and has been clear on seeing. That last point around funding, in the National Agreement there's also a commitment to governments doing an Indigenous expenditure review. We all know, we all see that government will talk about how many hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars are spent on Aboriginal programs and outcomes, and yet our communities look over the shoulder, look around and ask the question of where. Like, where is this money? Where's the outcomes for this money? Some communities have driven a process of doing what they refer to as service mapping, where they can see that there's like $60 million coming into a community, and they then find that there's 4 service providers funded to provide the same service. Only one of those services is actually working with Aboriginal community. And there's times where the services are receiving funds and they've had one interaction with Aboriginal people in an 18-month period. Like those are at the extreme end of the scale, but we all know that there are services that are being funded and not delivering in community. The other example that is used is that our mob, like particularly our young people, they need help from 9 to 5, but some of the issues that need assistance in our communities happen after hours. They happen on weekends. And if the way that funding is delivered is that services stop at 5 o'clock, they're not actually servicing our communities. So those are again some of the examples that people use on the way through in the consultation. In terms of key messages from community, relationship with community. So there's a highlight here around relationship. And as much as I've talked about examples, we've got some specific quotes or some more specific context. And talk about how it's been reflected in the model. So overall, there were key messages that we heard that go to what community wants to be different, or what community wants to be different about this mechanism. From CAPO's point of view, there is no point delivering a new mechanism unless it meets community's expectations. And the reason I make that point is that we often see people talk about consultation fatigue, people talk about frustration in our communities. We've all been to consultations where we've said exactly what we want to see, and then what we get back does not reflect what we've said. Because what happens is our wishes and our views are then watered down, diluted, and shaped to represent what government or the public service is comfortable with or think they can achieve. So the process we took with this model is exactly what we committed to do with community, and that is reflect the full scope and scale of what community was asking for. So overall, there were key messages that go to what community wants to be different about this mechanism, and there's no point talking about delivering a new mechanism unless it meets these expectations. So relationship with community. So relationship with community must be at the heart of the mechanism's work. Regular consultations are the bare minimum. Community really wants more, ideally, to see an embedded connection in its work and structure through physical offices, representatives in place, or through local regional bodies that feed into a state body. The mechanism needs power and teeth. Community are tired of seeing report after report, inquiry after inquiry being ignored. The mechanism needs to have a way to enforce change if it can be achieved through influence. Aboriginal leadership, The mechanism must be Aboriginal owned and led. For community, this means identified roles, particularly at the leadership level, but ideally throughout the organisation as much as possible. It means leaders of the mechanism having the right technical skills, but also genuine connections to community and grassroots. This will require investing in a pipeline of Aboriginal people to have the right skills to staff this organisation. So when we're talking about that component there, part of what came from community is also making sure that in any independent accountability mechanism, there's actually forethought into how it is going to develop an Aboriginal community talent pool, for example. So if there are young people that are interested in looking at mechanisms, looking at accountability, looking at particular technical skills, so if we're talking about the need to be able to analyse and research data, if we're talking about legal skills, basically looking at making sure that we don't just set this thing up, but also have a pipeline of our people coming through. It's like, when I look at something like this, it's the sort of thing where, in reality, my grandkids will be, and their generation will be the ones that would be really driving this as it goes into the future. In terms of key messages and how they've been included, this table or this graphic here is how the key messages have been included. The brown on the right is what community told us. The orange is how it's been included in the model. So, for example, Aboriginal leadership, how it's included in the model is is the authority board positions will be identified. Leaders will be the bridge between community, between the government and community. In terms of demonstrated independence, the mechanism will be legislated as an independent body. And that was a key strong piece from community, is that it needs to be legislated, so it therefore has the teeth. Embed community connection, so the mechanism will have a social accountability wing. Staff will be based across New South Wales where possible, so having a head office in Sydney and having no way for community to interact within in the regions is not ideal, so that's being built in. Hard powers or teeth available when needed, so a sliding scale of positive and negative levers supporting proportionate and escalating responses to drive change, and powers to be legislated where possible. And then permanent and ongoing fixture, the mechanism will be legislated, and it is recommended that funding for the mechanism be ongoing and immune from political oversight. So when we talk about funding being immune from political oversight, that's not about whether or not it would be audited. It's more about making sure that the funding it receives and the way that that funding is appropriated is not dependent or reliant on electoral cycles. So talking about making sure that it would have 10 years of funding, which would be 2.5 election cycles, basically giving it the freedom and the opportunity to be able to do its work without having to worry about spending time going to the government of the day, convincing it to continuing to fund it. And so in terms of functions, how this reflects what we heard from community, these are the, am I jumping around? These are the functions that community recommended in phase 1 and how they are rated in phase 2 and how they are included in the functions. So we've talked a bit about some of these. The first column is what functions we heard from community. The second column is ranking of the functions by community. Top is the most popular, going down to least popular. The third column is about accountability goals. And the fourth column is where these functions are included in the recommended model. These are the features, so moving on to the features and having a graphical representation. These are the features that community recommended in phase 1. They were all confirmed as important by community in phase 2. So that when we say confirmed as important, that's 90% agreed. This is the stages where we recommend these features be incorporated into the mechanism. These are the tools that community recommended in phase 1 and how they were rated in phase 2. So from top to bottom ranking, the middle column is ranking by community who did the survey. Last column is ranking by community who participated in face-to-face workshops. The colours show how they have or have not been included in the recommended model. Blue included in the recommended model. Orange to be considered when designing the sliding scale of levers to drive change. And brown is not included because of duplication or because they are better undertaken by a different organisation. So structures new or existing. So survey participants were asked if they would prefer a new body or a reformed existing body to house the mechanism. A new body was the most popular choice, but neither response received over 50% of the votes, so community's preference is not clear-cut. So an existing body or reformed, expanded to include accountability organisations, ranked at 32%. New body ranked at 49%, so doesn't get over the 50% threshold, but that's a relatively strong indication. And there was 19% of our community that didn't have a preference either way. They just their view was we need an accountability mechanism. Advantages of a new body. Current existing organisations are not effective in meeting communities' needs. If the existing ones were sufficient, we wouldn't be having this discussion, was one of their clear quotes. Advantages of an established body, however, is that they reduce the risk of establishing a duplicate service. They have the ability to somewhat hit the ground running using its existing structure, networks and credibility. Government might be more likely to agree to expanding or reforming an existing body because it would be less of an ask. In terms of structures, participants were also asked to react to 4 possible structures for the mechanism, including rating them out of 5, in terms of which they believe to be the most effective as an accountability mechanism. So reform an expanding or existing shared decision-making body was rated 3.8 out of 5. New roles, so a commissioner or series of commissioners was ranked at a 3.45 out of 5. When we talk about commissioners or commissioner, that's the closest reference is the Productivity Commission. Dedicated position within an existing body, e.g. Closing the Gap First Nations or Closing the Gap All First Nations Auditor General, that ranked at a 3.42, and a new body, e.g. elected accountability body, scored a 3.35 out of 5. So all 4 received good support, with scores ranging from 67% to 76%. The most popular choice was a reformed or expanded decision-making body, and the least popular was an elected accountability body, although scores were relatively close between them. So in some regards, you're splitting hairs. There was interest expressed in a combined model that would bring together community relationships and accountability authority, e.g. shared decision-making and Commissioner or Auditor General. So it's that blend of social and authority. The two most popular bodies have been included in the model as a combined suggestion. So, reformed or expanding existing body or existing shared decision-making body. So, formal partnership with New South Wales CAPO to facilitate the social accountability wing, and new roles, e.g. commissioner or series of commissioners, being represented as an authority which has a board, so new roles with different names. In terms of, I'll jump back just to, so the graphic at the bottom is showing the connection of social accountability, administrative accountability, and talking about the Office of Accountability Authority. This graphic talks about community feedback regarding the structure for the mechanism and how this is, so the brown column is community feedback, the green column is how it's been included in the recommended model structure. A combined model of shared decision-making and an administrative authority might be appropriate for the mechanism. This would be to combine community relationships, place-based staff and accountability authority. So the recommended structure captures those. A strength of shared decision-making option is its links to community, thereby promoting Aboriginal leadership and ownership. The mechanism should work with existing Aboriginal structures rather than duplicating or undermining the work of these existing structures. The model recommends establishing a formal partnership with New South Wales CAPO to act as a social accountability structure. What this doesn't go all the way to talking about and talking to is the fact that we know that there's already or communities that are organised. So the idea of having CAPO facilitating interaction with community is not to then say to community, you have to create a new structure or you have to do things this way or that way. It's about providing the conduit. And where there isn't an existing structure, making sure the community has the support to develop that for themselves. Access to specific knowledge, qualifications and expertise and accountability processes is a strength of the Commissioner and the Auditor General options. How that's represented is that board members will be required to have technical qualifications and a mix of those. It would be an advantage to include multiple leaders within the structure to not rely so heavily on just one person's skill set. So rather than having an individual commissioner, having a board and having multiple commissioners, for example. It would be an advantage. Elections create divisions in communities, and those selected through elections might not have the right skills. The way that issue is addressed is that board members will be appointed based on skill sets and technical skills, lived experience, and community connections. That's the bit where we talked about earlier about having an independent committee basically doing the appointment. The mechanism should not be Sydney-centric. It needs to have place-based connections and community. Board and office staff will be located around New South Wales where possible. Place-based partnerships will be encouraged to partner with the authority if interested. So that's how the things we've heard from community is represented in the structure that's suggested. In terms of key messages from the research, so to quickly look at the three key messages about balancing accountability that come from research which influence the model as well. There is a fine balance when looking to achieve accountability. It is important to consider how much accountability is in any given system. If there's too little, there is a risk. There is the risk of risks of corruption and underperformance. But if there's too much, it can stifle innovation and lead to people focusing on short-term KPIs rather than transformative change. B, it should be a mechanism ideally needs to have a balance of accountability tools that use hard and soft powers, i.e. enforcing change is a hard power versus influencing change, which is a soft power. People are more likely to change if they are brought on a journey and convinced to change their behaviour. However, if an accountability mechanism does not have the ability to enforce change, it will be seen as a toothless tiger very quickly, which reduces individuals' motivation to follow its advice. Wherever possible, change should be driven through assistance, education, and positive reinforcement, but the mechanism must have a stick or a bite available when change can't otherwise be achieved. Point C is that accountability mechanisms can pursue different goals. So the accountability goals in the table on the right come from Associate Professor Alan Rock. Focusing too much on one goal can reduce a mechanism's success in other goals. So there's a decision to be made to focus on one or two goals heavily, knowing that others may not be achieved by this particular mechanism, or to focus on lots of goals, but to be careful not to drive too hard at one and keep a careful balance between them, or keep a careful balance. What other models did we consider? So to start with, we undertook a mapping exercise. We looked at social, administrative accountability processes that already exist in New South Wales and compared them against ROC's 6 accountability goals to identify gaps in the current system. This identified a lack of Aboriginal-led and social accountability processes focused on deterrence, control and punishment, hence the call from community for the need. You can see in the diagram, the Aboriginal-led processes in orange are focused on transparency and reform, while the bodies focused on deterrence, control and punishment, the goals that normally have more teeth, are mainstream administrative bodies. ICAC, Auditor General, the Deputy Ombudsman's Office, New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. So there's a gap in the middle between combining teeth and social accountability. We considered what options there might be to reform existing administrative accountability bodies. Following a review of these structures, two opportunities stood out for expanding existing structures to meet the requirements of the mechanism. So the Deputy Ombudsman for Aboriginal Programs and the Auditor General for New South Wales. The viabilities of these options was dependent on their reputation with Aboriginal people in New South Wales. Given the importance of public trust and accountability mechanisms, while resourcing, scope and appointment processes can be altered, public perception is not so easily changed. And the reason we say that is that if you've lost the trust of our community, it takes a lot to win back that trust. So New South Wales CAPO found through the consultations and through considerations that these options were not recommended, as participants in community engagements expressed a lack of trust in the bodies and their independence. Participants also noted that they didn't meet expectations regarding community involvement, Aboriginal leadership and the ability to drive change. We also considered alternative shared decision-making bodies that could become formal partners with the authority to embed social accountability in its structure. Sorry, jumping around again. So as I was saying, we also considered alternative shared decision-making bodies that could become formal partners with the authority to embed social accountability in its structure. We did not consider that any of the current shared decision-making bodies could act solely as the accountability mechanism, because they play a partnership and advocacy role with government. That would make this a conflict of interest. Instead, the Social Accountability Wing will have a key role as the facilitator of community involvement, supporting the inclusion of all community members and members of shared decision-making bodies. Options were limited to existing bodies in response to community's recommendation that the mechanism strengthen existing structures rather than add to the already complex network of Aboriginal processes and bodies. Possible options were identified as New South Wales CAPO and empowered communities and regional alliances. New South Wales CAPO, done it again. Ready to run. So I'll close. I realise we're at time, so I'll close off on these points. But so New South Wales CAPO was recommended to facilitate the role for three key reasons. It is the formal signatory to the national agreement representing the interests of Aboriginal people in New South Wales and advocating for in New South Wales for closing the gap. So in some regards, it makes sense for it to continue leading on community involvement in this process. The place-based partnerships that are being established under the New South Wales Implementation Plan will be part of the National Closing the Gap network. This will enable other independent mechanisms to consider replicating a similar design. It has coverage across New South Wales in its membership, while empowered communities operate in a limited number of communities. All existing bodies will be encouraged to participate in community engagements to make sure a collective view is shared. Given that we've got the next panel coming, I'll sort of wrap up there.
Can I give comment? Sharif, or are you just going to tell us stuff and not allow the community to talk on transparency and accountability? Just wondering.
Well, that's the point now. in
So
terms
there's
of...
no time for the community to give feedback to the organisation that's developed this and then presented it and it is now giving it back around accountability and transparency. Is that correct?
So you know yourself that you have had opportunity to provide feedback and input.
Collective opportunity as people that are on the ground to comment directly in a public forum about the fact that CAPO, who is funded by New South Wales Government, conducted the consultations, pulled in the research, wrote the mechanism, selected the 20 people to give feedback in the co-design, fed it up to the JC, which is made up of CAPO and government, and then recommended themselves as the accountability mechanism.
So I believe that consultation has been run.
By yourselves.
And
Recommending yourselves in a model of transparency and accountability.
if you read the report
I have read
and
the report.
have a look at the recommendations, we're not saying that we are the be-all and end-all.
You're saying
The role for CAPO, you've asked the question, I'll respond.
Yeah, come on, mate, because you haven't talked enough.
The role for CAPO is around facilitating community. So I think I've been pretty clear on
You
that.
can't talk to it. You are. You stood up the front, and now you can't even talk.
Well, I've been asked to present on this. To be fair, I've done what I was asked to do, and to be fair, you've had multiple opportunities to speak to this before. And
Individually, not as a group, as a collective.
there were open consultations, and we're mindful of the fact that we've done what we can to make sure that we are open. There hasn't been a closed consultation process. We haven't hand-selected, picked and chosen who comes.
Who picked the 20 people that participated in the co-design?
So the deliberative forum was an open expression of interest for people who were interested to come.
Who pulled together the people who submitted the expression of interest?
We didn't pull together who committed the expressions of interest. They were open to anyone to apply and be involved. And you know some of the people that applied and were involved. The Joint Council of New South Wales. So the New South Wales Closing the Gap Joint Council is made up of the signatories to the Closing the Gap National Agreement. The signatories to the National Agreement are New South Wales CAPO, as members of the Coalition of Peaks, and New South Wales Government.
So you've made a consultation process, a design report, then you've fed it up to a committee that exists of yourself and government, you're funded by government, and you've recommended yourselves as a transparency and accountability mechanism.
I'll say again, and I will disagree with how you've chosen to characterise it. I think I've been very clear that we're not the accountability mechanism. We don't hold ourselves up to be. The recommendation is that an independent accountability mechanism be established, that it be legislated, and that there be a social accountability wing, which is community, not CAPO, community. The fact that you selectively choose to ignore that says a lot more about your motivations for raising this the way that you have versus what is actually there.
Sorry, just to be respectful of everybody in the room.
Sorry.
That's all right. But they're just spaces and places to have yarns. And ways to do it.
Where are they?
Okay. Apologies to everybody.
Yeah, I'll apologise everyone too for getting into it. So yeah.
I think that we can all have those yarns, but we are out of time.
Sorry.
The reason why I came in, the other session is still started. But obviously, this is something of interest, right? And so it should be.
Okay.
We're talking about accountability of governance to actual people. The passion that you hear in these rooms is real. That's something that we black people live with on the daily, so it's nothing new. But it is to say there are ways of doing it, that we can hold ourselves to that level. But I just want to say thank you to Sharif for being able to hold that space, this space, and put yourself in a position to be able to speak to that.
Yeah.
And to each and every one of you to sit through that.
I know you got a question. I'll come and yarn to you if that's okay. Yeah. Thank you everyone for your patience. Sorry, it's quite detailed, so I wanted to give everyone the respect of understanding that not everyone had the opportunity because people's lives are busy. They don't necessarily get the opportunity to be involved in the consultation processes. So we wanted to be transparent, sharing back what's come from community, and to be completely honest, it is all driven by what community wants to see. Nothing's ever going to be perfect, but we wanted to make sure that we report back. Thank you. Cheers.